By practicing mindfulness regularly, you can protect these genes and prevent these illnesses and live more healthily into later life. And if we can begin to understand that we are in control to a certain extent, but not entirely, we can begin to find a different kind of bliss in surrender. I think in the age of AI, being able to unfocus is particularly important. The unfocused network in the brain is one of the key networks that doesn't just improve your psychology, it has the potential to improve your biology as well. 5 to 15 minutes of napping gives you 1 to 3 hours of clarity.
Dr. Srini Pillay is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist, brain researcher, and best-selling author. As the leading resident in Harvard psychiatry, he directed the Anxiety Disorders Program at McLean Hospital and spent 17 years as a brain imaging researcher. Dr. Pillay also pioneered transformational neurocoaching and advises Fortune 500 companies, the UN, and the World Bank, among many other companies globally. You've changed my life. You've changed my life already, and really helping to unlock some dormant capacities and really kind of gave me permission to see things in a different way. You've been really helping everyone to reassociate how we think about focus. In fact, you talk about the power of being unfocused. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, firstly, the idea of changing your life is sort of an amazing thought, but I've already gotten a sense that there's a lot of creativity to unlock in you, and I can't wait to see the different ways in which it's going to manifest. So a lot of people think that focus is the way to get through the day, right? Everyone talks about focus. It's like focus, fatigue, and then you're out for the count. But the problem with that is that in the brain, there are two circuits which are often competing with each other. There's the focus circuit, which is in the prefrontal cortex, which we use to go through lists, figure out when to come here, how to write a book. But at the same time, there's the unfocused circuit. And the unfocused circuit is, it's called the default mode network, which we used to think was the do mostly nothing network, the DMN. But now we realize that network is super important. It's the network in the brain that allows you to juggle multiple things at the same time. It allows you to think abstractly. It's also called the crystal ball of the human brain. And so if you start focusing, you turn that part of your intelligence off, which is most people think intelligence is just focusing and absorbing information. But intelligence is also associating things. Right. Intelligence is also knowing that you have enough brain energy. And focus can take that energy away. Also, when you overly focus, what a lot of people don't realize is that when you're focused on one thing, you're not paying attention to what's around you. Right? You might be focused on your work. You might lose a girlfriend because you just didn't pay attention. You might focus on one invention like Anne Wang did. And when Anne Wang focused on making the word processor version 2, the PC was happening, but he wasn't looking around him. And so he became bankrupt. Also, if you focus with your nose to the grindstone and you're like, no, things are going to stay the same. I'm just focused on what I'm doing. You're not paying attention to upcoming trends. So you're not going to know, what AI to be aware of. You're not going to know, what to pay attention to that's coming in the future. And what a lot of people don't realize is that in the brain, the part of your brain that makes up the story about who you are, the autobiographical self, is actually the unfocused network. So, nobody is their LinkedIn profile. You go to a LinkedIn profile, you're like, what is that? Like, sometimes people will introduce me like my LinkedIn profile, and I'll be like, yeah, that's like what I did, but it's not necessarily who I am. What we know is that the focus network will not allow you to collect the important elements of your life story to make up a narrative about who you are. But the unfocused network does. So what the unfocused network, and also when you're focused on one thing. But as you know, I think a lot of your books have been this way. When you unfocus, you make associations other people would never have thought to make. And it's when you're unfocusing that this creativity comes out. So what I wanted to tell people was that unfocusing is a way of refueling your brain for more energy. It's a way of becoming more creative. It's a way of paying attention to what's around you so you don't miss out. It's a way of paying attention to future trends. And it's also a way of connecting more deeply with who you are. And I think one of the greatest tragedies that I've seen is that people will just focus, and then pass out. but they don't take advantage of this unfocused brain that can take them through the vehicle of imagination into parts of themselves that they might never have known.
Yeah, yeah. In our culture today, more than ever, we are obsessed with trying to focus, trying to find a way to get stuff done, focus. And it's very rewarded in our culture. But as you mentioned, we have this whole other capacity that actually, in many ways, and you detail this in the book, it makes focusing on the things that we want to focus on even more fulfilling and rewarding. You gave a great analogy of focus being like a flashlight, right? But that's just looking at one specific domain. There's all this happening in the periphery that we can miss out on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what a lot of people, I think in the age of AI, being able to unfocus is particularly important because AI is, think about ChatGPT. You basically can ask it pretty much anything you want to ask it, and it will do it. So there's real estate that's not getting used in your brain. And if you think of use it or lose it, then you have to ask yourself, if I'm not thinking about the stuff anymore, what's happening with that part of my brain? If I'm not remembering, then what's happening to my memory center? And then all of a sudden people are saying, well, there are alarming rates of dementia, or there are increasing rates of suicide amongst the young. Well, if you don't have meaning making in your brain, which is created largely through the unfocused network, then you're not going to feel like life is anything. So I think it's super important to not just have that focused flashlight, but to recognize that you can explore the depths of your own being through the techniques that I outlined in the book. When I wrote the book, I was sort of like, I argued with my agent for a while because I was like, no one's going to know what this Tinker Dabble Doodle Try is. And she said, no, but I like the ring of it because I think people are actually yearning to play. But a lot of us, when we grow up, we're like, I don't know, play is when you're younger. When you grow up, maybe you can play with your kids. But playfulness is something that we lose. And I think it's a tragedy when you lose the capacity to play. And people don't even realize that the capacity to play involves fantasy. And fantasy is what happens when you're like, let me imagine, like, what if I were something? And what's interesting, and we can get to this at some point, is that kind of fantasy actually protects the body. It actually helps you become more physically well. There's a Paris Psychosomatic Institute that studies the connection between the mind and the body. And one of the things they said was that people who engage in fantasy more are actually physically better off as well. So I think the unfocused network in the brain is one of the key networks that doesn't just improve your psychology, it has the potential to improve your biology as well.
That's so powerful. You also share some fascinating data. There's a ton of studies that you reference in the book as well. But one of them was really interesting in looking at how focus can actually handicap us in other things that we see as valuable, like compassion, right? And you shared a study where being hyper-focused actually led to study participants being less likely to help other people. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So this was a study in which they took two groups of people and they exposed them to a video. And so one video, one group they asked to focus intensely, and the other group they said, just look at things the way you would ordinarily look at it. And then at the end of looking at it, they gave them a challenge of people needing help in a particular scenario. And they said, what would you do? The people who focused, they couldn't care less. They're like, I don't know, they can drown. Like, I just don't care. And so many people feel like this at the end of the day. When they're driving home or they're like completely wiped out and you're like, what would you do to help someone in some country? And they're like, what? I don't care. But when they fed that group glucose, they started to care again, indicating that it wasn't that they were fundamentally not compassionate. They had just drained their brains of the ability to care. We call that compassion fatigue. And so focus can really exacerbate compassion fatigue. And a lot of people don't recognize this. They don't even recognize this with their own spouses. When a spouse is working all day, just super focused, and they come home, they're not necessarily meaning to ignore the other person. But the other person's like, what's with you? Like, where's the compassion? And so what happens is they end up not having the energy to care. And I think caring is I'm going to make another leap here, because I think caring is something that is related to human relationships and connection. And it is among the top variables that is associated with healthy longevity. Having good relationships, people who have good relationships live longer. And it's as important as cholesterol, as important as a lot of things we think of more concretely. So if you have a brain that is being wired not to care, again, you're compromising not just your emotional state, but you're compromising your physical state as well.
You didn't know this, but really focusing on relationships and the impact that they have on our health has really been what my work has been centered around the last few years. And, just even referencing Dr. Waldinger's work out of Harvard and the longest running longitudinal study on human longevity. And he's a skeptic, which is like, I could relate to that because he didn't believe the data himself, that what stood out the most was having warm social relationships or healthy social bonds stood out more than anything. Beating exercise, not to say that they're not valuable, exercise, good nutrition, dealing with stress. It was the quality of the relationships that determined how long people are going to live more than anything else. And that's because, from my perspective, and I asked him about this, like, what do you think it is? He gave the example of it really helps you to metabolize stress if you're able to offload and to connect with other people. And it is a buffer just to know that somebody's there, somebody's got your back. For me, it's expansive. Every decision that we make, whether it is with my nutrition or with my sleep habits or whatever, my wife is the most influential person in all of that stuff, And so the quality of our relationships are so important, but we're finding ourselves more and more depleted in our society today. And you talk about this term that you call inattentional blindness, right? You mentioned this a little bit earlier. You kind of just went through it, but I'm so focused at work, but then you lose a girlfriend. Right. And so how often is that happening in relationships today just because we're so depleted, because we're trying to be hyper-focused to get stuff done so that we can be with the people that we love, but we're not showing up as our best selves?
Yeah, I think firstly, people are so amazingly complex, right? And if you don't spend time hanging out with people, you're going to miss out on some of the most important things about who they are, because they are not their LinkedIn profile. They're not their job title. There's all kinds of amazing things about people you love. And so hanging out is a way of letting that information arrive, right? It's a way of, it's a little bit like when we were speaking earlier, and we only spoke for a short time, but as you were speaking, I was like, what's the music beneath this person's utterances? Because I can feel there's a kind of musicality underneath what you're saying, because there's a poetic mechanism that's involved in associations for you. And so that's not something you're going to say. You're going to say, hi, I'm Shawn. I have poetic associations, and there's a musicality that's underneath. But by just hanging out, you get that sensation, and you don't even necessarily have to say what that is. So intimacy, I think, is something everybody wants, but we're living in a society that I think is very driven by, how people look, and there's nothing wrong with caring about how you look or how somebody else looks, but there's much more to life than just caring about that. There is the ability to really feel this kind of intimacy that I think Waldinger talks about, because he even says it's not necessarily about your primary partner, it's also about the people in your life. Right. Now, if you think about one mechanism, which I think this is one of probably 100 that I could potentially think of, if you think of the fact that we have mirror neurons in our brains, and what these neurons do is they act like mirrors to other people's emotions. So if you're in a toxic relationship, your brain is automatically representing that toxicity. And so it's your emotional state is already taken in that direction. And when your emotional state is taken in that direction, you might do one of several things. You might suppress your emotions. You're like, what, I can't, the person I'm with is so toxic, but if I say something, they're going to say something. So I might as well just say nothing. But emotional suppression has been associated with a higher chance of dying over a 12-year study. And so people who don't say what they're feeling are at a greater risk. There's a greater risk of cancer. There's a trend towards greater problems with cardiac disease. I don't think about, people will sometimes are taken aback because they're like, wait a minute, like, what do you mean you don't believe in psychiatry? And I'll say, well, because I don't believe the brain stops functioning at the level of the neck. That you wouldn't be able to move your right foot if it wasn't because of the brain. Your brain is connected to your adrenal gland. It's connected to your gut. It's connected to your heart. So when you're having emotions, these emotions are in your brain, but whatever you're doing with this activation is spreading to the rest of your body. It's one of the reasons I co-founded Roulette, which is an AI-driven platform that helps people make mindset shifts, not just so that you can go from being distracted to being focused or pessimistic to optimistic or uncertain to confident, but I just recently wrote a paper with colleagues from Mayo Clinic showing that every one of those mindset shifts is associated with a change in your biology. Optimists have 11 to 15% longer lifespans. People who are distracted, not strategically unfocused, but people who are distracted, people with ADHD have twice the rate of death before the age of 46. So your mindset is not just about what's in your mind. It impacts your genes. It impacts. We just know from so many other things that the ability to be related to someone is the ability to be present. And focus is not the only way to be present. If you've ever hung out with somebody, you can be in a totally unfocused mode and still be present. Yeah. So I think relationships are key to our overall health. And I think relationships are underestimated in their importance in terms of our physical health as well.
Yes, yes. So being that we can deplete ourselves just throughout a work day of just trying to be focused and get stuff done, does this speak to the existence of like a brain reserve or a certain amount of energy that our brains have to make decisions and do stuff like that throughout the day?
Yeah. I often will say to people, let's say you have 100 units of attention. And if you let's say you get up in the morning and you're like, oh, let me read the news. Let me scroll through social media. All of a sudden, you've used up 70 units of attention. And then you go to work with 30 units of attention and you're like, why can't I solve this problem? Well, you just sold your attention to the world. In the attention economy, your attention got bought and you sold it for not a lot of money, metaphorically. So that the 30 units of attention that you have left, that's what you've got to work with. And I think we live at a time when, because of so many distractions around us, strategic unfocus is highly preferable to random distraction. And just focusing the whole day is not something that's going to allow you to take care of your own depth, of your relationships, and your physical and emotional health.
Let's dive in and talk about what's going on in the brain when we unfocus, because you detail all this in the book. And by the way, Tinker Dabble Doodle Try, Unlock the Power of the Unfocused Mind, available everywhere the books are sold. And you talk about when you are unfocusing, it reduces amygdala activation and creates calmness. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in our brain and changes in biology when we unfocus.
Well, I think unfocus can, like everything in medicine, everything in its opposite can happen. Mm-hmm. So we do know that unfocus can cause, mind wandering can be very anxiety provoking and can make people feel more depressed. But when you're hanging out, when you have what, for example, we're calling positive constructive daydreaming, which is different from just daydreaming at your desk. You're doing something low key, like knitting or gardening or walking, and then you let your mind go and you start imagining something wishful, like maybe running through the woods with your dog or lying on a yacht. And immediately your mind goes into this unfocused, more relaxed state. When you're in this relaxed state, you are no longer at the mercy of your anxious mind focusing on all the negative things in your life. You are actually recognizing that you have the ability to tune into other frequencies. And when you do, unfocusing turns on this default mode network. And when it turns on the default mode network, this network is connected to multiple regions in the body. And one of the regions that it's connected to is the emotional processing regions in the brain, the limbic system, and part of which is the amygdala. So the amygdala is one of those areas in the brain that starts alarming whenever you're under tremendous amounts of stress. And when you do, because it's connected to your thinking brain, it disrupts your thinking. And anyone who's been very anxious knows this, right? Or you go into fight or flight mode, you're like, where do I run? How do I go? What do I do? I'm putting out fires. And when you're in a putting out fires state of mind, you have lost your connection with yourself. You've lost your connection with who you are. And so this moving away from this hyperamygdala activation, there are a number of ways you can do this. There are more cognitive ways. Like there's a thing that I teach, a mnemonic called CIRCA, which is 5 steps to access your brain to turn down this alarm. So the first C in CIRCA is chunking, which means you break things down. You don't just get up on a Monday morning and like, oh my God, I have like 5 million things to do this week. What do I do? So chunking is essentially breaking things down and not just feeding your brain like a ton of information at the same time. It's also ruthlessly prioritizing. So telling yourself throughout the day, there's some stuff I have to get done. There's some stuff I hope I get done. And there's some stuff, if I don't get to it, it's not going to be the end of the world. And chunking is also about delegating, right? It's about telling people, saying to yourself, I can't do all of this. Somebody else can do that. Somebody else can do that. So it's about breaking stuff down. Awesome. And what people don't realize is that when you get up in the morning and you fill your brain with your whole week's schedule, and then your brain goes into a freak out and your amygdala starts overactivating. So just using self-talk or sitting down and saying, let me just spend 1 minute and see what I have to do now and what I have to do later, that immediately calms your brain down. Mm-hmm. Then there's the I for ignore mental chatter, which is essentially mindfulness. And the way you practice that is you close your eyes, you place your attention on your breath like a flashlight, and if your mind starts wandering, you gently bring the flashlight back to your breath, which sounds like so what? Like, why would you do that? Well, studies have shown that not only decreases amygdala activation, that can also protect your genes. So if you look at the ends of our genes, there are telomeres, which as you get older, they get shorter and shorter, and eventually we get illnesses and then we die. Well, Elizabeth Blackburn and her colleagues have found that by practicing mindfulness regularly, you can protect these genes and prevent these illnesses and live more healthily into later life. But if you're someone who says, nah, I don't like meditation, I don't want to do that, well, there are other ways to do this. There was a recent study at Stanford that showed that cyclic sighing is one way you can begin to regulate what's going on inside you. It's another way to ignore mental chatter. And the way you do this is you breathe into 3/4 of the way, and then you breathe in right to the top, and then you breathe out slowly. And if you just do that for 5 minutes, that study found that it was even more effective than mindfulness meditation. So the idea of ignoring mental chatter has a lot of deeper ramifications as well. I think from a spiritual perspective, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali would say that we think we are the noise of our minds. But when the noise of our minds is still, the real us is available to be experienced. And so a lot of the anxiety we experience is from the false self. It's from the chatter of the mind. Whereas when we get beyond the false self, we get to this place where we can actually be connected with this more ethereal, maybe even intangible aspect of who we are. The R in CIRCA is reality check, which is basically this too shall pass. You use self-talk. Let's say you have something horrible, you miss a deadline, you messed up in some way. There's no way to put a positive spin on it. It's good to remind your brain that this is not going to last forever. Because your brain, once there's something negative, it immediately creates this illusion that it's going to be there all the time. They're like, oh, that money you didn't have, you're never going to have that money. And so your brain goes into an even greater freak out. But if you say, well, I don't have that now, but this is going to pass, and I'm going to get to the next step. Just doing that calms your brain down. Then there's control check, which is essentially like the serenity prayer. What's the stuff I can control? What's the stuff I can't control? And knowing the difference between the two. A lot of people will be like, oh, do you hear what's happening in this country or that country? What's happening? Well, are you going to do anything about it? Because if you want to suffer, I cannot legitimately tell you there are not enough reasons to suffer. There are plenty of reasons to suffer. But if you are committed to having a life that is more elated, joyful, that is more connected to bliss, then you have to be committed to that. And to be committed to that, you have to ask yourself, what can I control? What can I not control? And if I can control it, why don't I let go? Another version of this was Lady Gaga, who reached a point in her career where she spoke to Yale students and she said, I didn't feel like singing. And they were like, what do you mean? She said, I just didn't want to sing anymore. And they were like, but you're so talented, so well known. She said, because I was having to like make other people money. I had to sell perfumes. And I didn't want to sell, but I don't even like perfumes. I had to take selfies. And she's like, I'm an artist. I have more to give the world. And slowly, she said, she started to say to herself, I better say no to some of this stuff. And the more she started to say no, the more she respected herself. And she said, I went home and I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, I can sleep with any day. Because you've got integrity, you know what you stand for. And I think so many of us think, well, we're not Lady Gaga, we can't say no to everything. Sure, I get that. But there's at least one thing in everybody's life they could say no to. And that's what that C is about, in decreasing the amygdala activation. And then the last A is attention shift. And attention shift is, how do we shift away from the problem to the solution? Because we spend so much time talking about our problems, but if we don't know the solution, we don't go to the land of where solutions live. And this morning in my meditation, I had this realization of a common thought, which I've thought about in many ways before. Many other people have said this, but for some reason, it really hit home when I realized there were two metaphors that converged simultaneously. One was that I was in charge of whether I wanted to open the channel of joy. And that if I turn that channel open, it will open the channel for joy to arrive through it. And another metaphor of that is frequency. If I make a decision to commit to the frequency of joy, then that's what will come to me. Now, some people would say, but I'm not feeling joyful. I can't just switch. Actually, you can. You can say, why don't I spend 5 minutes? Maybe I'm miserable the rest of the time. I don't care. But for 5 minutes today, I'm just going to open up what that channel is and let my life be affected by what that is. And if you're struggling to think of joyful things, there's some very simple things out there. Look at a sunrise. Look at the sunset. Look at dogs running on a beach. There's some amazing things. And I happen to believe, even though I have plenty of stressed out days, I do correct, if I'm not in a blissful state, I feel like I'm not connected to my real self. And so I feel like, there's this whole term in Hinduism, which is Satchit Ananda, which is being, consciousness, bliss, that our fundamental nature is bliss. And we forget that because we are distracted by the happenings in the world. And I think if we can, every time you're feeling not blissful, if you say to yourself, wait a minute, did I just lose contact with who I am? Because I think maybe I did. It will train your brain to remember that bliss is something you can correct to. And as I said, there are all kinds. You can do that in an elevated way. I used to half joke around that I was somewhere between martinis and meditation. So I feel like there are things you can do to help yourself get there, as long as you don't think that that's the agentic bliss you're looking for. But these 5 steps: chunking, ignore mental chatter, reality check, control check, and attention shift, are 5 brain-based ways in which you can target your brain. And these have all been shown to decrease amygdala activation in the brain.
This is a mic drop already. This is so powerful. If we just take those tools on, it could change our lives, And when you were talking about just this, when we can get kind of caught up and trapped in worry and forgetting, to feel how we want to feel, to experience our true selves, it got me thinking about habitual worry and this state of contrast avoidance that some people have. Like they have a problem for every solution. They're always looking for something to worry about. Can you talk about contrast avoidance a little bit?
Sure. So in my first book, Life Unlocked: 7 Revolutionary Lessons to Overcome Fear, I talk a lot about. I looked at the research for so why do people worry? And the finding was both remarkable, but also kind of interesting to think about more deeply. So the leading theory for why people worry right now is called contrast avoidance theory. And what that means is that in life we have peak moments, right? When you make money, fall in love, go for the most amazing swim. And then you have these trough moments, these low moments where you lose a job, lose a loved one. People who worry keep themselves in the miserable middle because they're afraid of the contrast between elation and despair. So they're like, if I'm slightly miserable all the time, if something bad happens, then at least the fall won't be as much. And so they avoid that contrast. And you might ask, well, why would people want to avoid being elated? It's because being incredibly happy and free is not as easy as it sounds. Kierkegaard, the philosopher, said, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. He said, we all say we want to be free, but look around you, every one of us. The first thing we do is, how do I put a ball and chain in my life? And then how do I limit my freedom? And then say, oh, well, that's life. You can't be free. But no matter what the ball and chain in your life is, and I guarantee there's not a single person on earth who will not be able to identify that. Ask yourself, how can I still have freedom? Because freedom is intimidating. When we think of freedom at its height, we think we're just wild, losing all our relationships, doing whatever we want to do. And I think that is not necessarily what freedom is. Freedom is the ability, it starts with the ability to connect with something much greater than ourselves. And then to learn how to tolerate what's happening at that frequency of energy. I think anyone who's meditated would tell you that meditation in your evolution, it's terrifying at certain points. Because at certain points you're like, what's happening here? Am I in free fall? Like, is this? But once you learn to tolerate and understand and accommodate that freedom, you realize, you know what? This thing about being committed to sucky things, maybe I shouldn't be. My biggest beef about psychiatry right now, and medicine in general, is that the tone of most messages is, I want to help you lead a slightly less lame life. Like, what kind of life is that? Like, most people want a kick-ass life. Most people want, they want to be on top of the world. They want to be energized. But we have an epidemic of a loss of vitality in our society. Most people don't realize, but they've given their energy away. They're like, whatever. I don't have that feeling. Or maybe once in a while. And then there are some people who will say you've got to juice or you've got to eat healthily. All these things, as you said, are important. But vitality doesn't have to have this condition associated with it. We are afraid of our most vital selves. When in fact, as Marianne Williamson said, we should not be afraid to shine. Because when we shine, we give others the permission to shine too. And so I think that contrast avoidance is one of those things that is super important for us. Anyone who's listening to this, what I'd love them to ask themselves is, do I have enough kick-ass moments in my week planned? Whether it's a great meal, amazing time with someone you love, doing something extraordinary. And if you don't, ask yourself, am I committed to the miserable middle? And if I am committed to the miserable middle, how can I give that up? Because the truth is, some of this takes acceptance, right? Profound acceptance that there are going to be amazing things in life, and there are some very tragic things that happen. And if we can begin to understand that we are in control to a certain extent, but not entirely, we can begin to find a different kind of bliss in surrender.
Oh my gosh. This is so fascinating. So fascinating. This got me thinking about some of the current state of affairs, and in addition, this got me also thinking about Barry Schwartz, the paradox of choice. So with relating focus and all of these options that we have, right? And just being, and you're trying to tell yourself, I need to focus, but there's so many options, right? So relating anxiety and freedom is something that I don't think many of us do. There's many flavors, of course, of anxiety. And this is something else that I admire about you, is that that there isn't one size fits all anxiety or depression or any of these, physical or mental conditions. And also the separation of the two is ignorant. Right. And understanding that we need to pay attention to ourselves, and we have the very best data on how to get from where we are to where we want to be. It's within us already. More so than any study, more so than any book. And we're big fans of studies and books. Right. But the truth is, it's within you and it's unique to you. And so if we can be aware of the situation that we're in, where we have immense freedom, so many different things to choose from, some of us can get overwhelmed. Some of us can be paralyzed. But this can bring about more of a reason for us to kind of, again, take back control of our minds and use our focus with intention, but also use our unfocus with intention. And so I want to talk a little bit more about this, and just to share really quickly some quick hitters on the default mode network. You talk about this in the book. So this really important, valuable aspect of the human brain, it acts as a distraction filter. You shared that. It builds mental flexibility. It integrates the past, present, and future. It helps you express your creativity. It helps you to dredge up intangible memories and connect cool things. So there's a lot that this default mode network does, but we're not accessing that if we're hyper-focused and depleting our focus. And so what I want to talk about now is how do we utilize unfocus with intention, and you give some strategies to unfocus. So I want to go through these right now and give everybody these insights on how to get there, right? And it's going to be different for different people, but these are some pretty practical science-backed ways to get there. One of them is a reverie. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so reverie is essentially similar to what I described in positive constructive daydreaming, where you are in a state of wishful imagining, and you give yourself permission to just keep going with the pleasure. So, let's say you say, oh, I'm lying in a field. And then you're thinking, oh, this is kind of amazing. Somebody I truly love kissed me gently on the forehead. And then we ran through a field together, holding hands, and then saw a pool. And when we saw the pool, we decided to dive in, and we were laughing. And as we were laughing, we saw a bird gently fly down onto a plant, and a butterfly. And we looked up at the sky and didn't realize that out of the blue, these clouds were coming over, and it started to rain. And we got drenched, but we were ecstatic. So I'm just building the story of, I could go on and on. How often do we let our minds build their own stories? Because if you could go on with that story, and it could become quite profound. You could say, I was lying next to this person and didn't understand why I both loved and hated them at the same time. And then you could be like, oh man, my reverie took me there. And you're like, yeah. And then I realized that whatever the physical was an illusion. And that actually the reason I was here on earth was to allow that ecstasy that I experienced on earth to open the door to the possibility of something more. And so reverie is the doorway to possibility. And what a lot of people do is they live in a highly probable world where the reality determines their commitments. Now, if reality determines your commitments, life's just going to suck, and you're just going to say, there's nothing I can do. But if your commitments determine your reality, now you're training that commitment with reverie, because you're saying, actually, life can be amazing. Now, when I say that to people are like, oh, that's not realistic. And what I say is, you have to take the responsibility to be the architect who draws the blueprint for your life. If you take your blueprint from life, it's not going to get you very far. But if you have the courage to actually draw up your own blueprint, and if you say, this is the blueprint I have, this is the ideal self that I want. Studies by Richard Boyatzis at Case Western have shown that people get much further on in life, not if they're putting out fires, but if they take the time to formulate an ideal self. And if you formulate an ideal self, it becomes the blueprint for your brain to say, oh, this is not part of the plan, this is part of the plan, this is not part of the plan. So when reverie opens up the door to possibility, and people will say, well, that's not highly probable. Well, think about it. If you want an exceptional life, it's an exception. And so no exceptional life is highly probable. If your life is highly probable, you are not on an exceptional track. You really want to live a life of low probability. And the way to breathe in a life of low probability is to breathe through the lens of possibility, of saying to yourself, okay, let me ask myself, what is possible? What in what world can I pursue this? And I often will tell people the story of two career moves in my life, which I feel really exemplify possibility for me. One was I was in South Africa at a conference, and I went to this great talk, and I was sort of nerding out about water intoxication and schizophrenia or something. And standing next to the speaker, waiting for a car to pick me up, and I just looked at him and I said, I really enjoyed your talk. And he said, oh, thanks very much. And I said, I'm just getting a major vibe here. I feel like you could change my life. And he looked at me and he said, well, in what way? And I said, I don't know. I'm telling you what I feel. And he said, well, what are you interested in? And I said, well, I'm really interested in the brain. I'm really interested in human emotions and trying to understand how I can bring physiology and emotion together. He said, well, I'm at the University of Stellenbosch. It was during apartheid in South Africa at the time. He said, there's a fellowship, the scholarship that's due tomorrow. We've never given it to a person of color before, and we've never given it to anyone in the field of psychiatry. The chances of you getting it are very low. But if you do get it, it will change your life. And I said, well, can I send an application? He said, yeah, sure. But I just know it's not highly likely. And so I sent the application to him. He walked it over. A few hours later, gave me a call and said, congratulations and welcome to Stellenbosch. And I was like, what? Like, how did that happen? And then I went to Stellenbosch. For a year, I was in this tiny dorm room. I had my own little sort of electric frying pan and a small refrigerator. And then I remembered my examiner, it was 2 years before that. My final examiner in South Africa happened to be from NYU. And so they would invite external examiners. And I had done particularly well. And he said, honestly, you should be at Harvard. And I was like, we have to take another exam in America. I was thinking of maybe going to England. And then I didn't even really know what it was. But on one particular day, in a state of reverie, I was like, I wonder what it would be like to be at Harvard. And so I called up Harvard. And I said, I want to speak to the head of Harvard. And the person was like, head of Harvard what? And I was like, well, if you want to get in, speak to the person at the top. And so they were like, okay, head of Harvard. I said, how about medical school? So I get through to the medical school. They were like, there are lots of departments here. Like, head of what? I said, how about psychiatry? And the head of department of psychiatry happened to be walking past his secretary's desk. She happened to go to the bathroom. He almost never picked up his phone. He picked up his phone and I said, hi, my name is Srini Pillay. I'm just sitting here in a small dorm room in South Africa thinking, boy, wouldn't it be great to be at Harvard? And he said, he told me later I thought you were crazy, but I thought, what can I say? I had to be decent. So he said, well, why don't you send me your CV and a note and I'll pass it around. We'll see what happens. And then a couple of weeks later, I get a call saying, Dr. Jonathan Cole, who's the father of psychopharmacology, wants to interview you. I get a phone interview. And then a couple of weeks later, I get a FedEx saying, congratulations and welcome to Harvard. Now, there are a lot of people who've done well, and I did do well, so it opened the door for me. But most people who did well would not embrace that possibility. And it's an extreme example, but imagine if in your life that equivalent is waiting for you and you just didn't dare to ask for it. Why not ask for the greatest possibility? And you might say, well, I can't get there because I'm in reality. Well, that's where Reverie comes in. Save some Reverie time. Let your mind flow. Let your body join you in what feels real for you. And as you said, the most intuitive things can light up for us. I mean, that in those instances, they were allowing my intuition to take over. Now, have I used my intuition and been wrong? 1,000,000 times, probably 1,000,000,000 times. But it's those few times when you get it right that actually make a difference in massive movements in your life. And so I think when Reverie opens the door to possibility, it not only activates the default mode network, but it allows that network to communicate, gathering all these little bits of information to put together a plan about how to get where you want to get to. And it's not all conscious. Much of it is outside of conscious control. So I encourage Reverie as a habit. I encourage possibility thinking, which is another way of activating this default mode network. You can, if you want to start simply, 5 to 15 minutes of napping gives you 1 to 3 hours of clarity. So why wouldn't you, when you're dragging in the middle of the afternoon, give yourself that gift? Positive constructive dreaming, which I mentioned earlier, is another way of activating that unfocused network. And another technique that I cover, and there are many more than that in the book, but is a technique called psychological Halloweenism, which is a term that I coined to describe a phenomenon where they gave the same person a creative problem to solve, They said, now I want you to be a rigid librarian and take on whatever you think the stereotype is. So they were like a rigid librarian standing there. And they were statistically significantly less likely to solve the problem if they were a rigid librarian than if they were an eccentric poet. So if you put on a cloak and you walk around like a poet, all of a sudden your brain has the permission to be creative. So when we cannot solve problems in life, it's not because we don't have the horsepower to do this. It's because we are stuck in a frozen self. And the default mode network codes for that self. And tapping into that unfocused network can allow you to change these different and rearrange these different components of yourself to be able to get to that next level.
It sounds like a superpower.
And we all have it. We have it in our brains. It's waiting there. It wants to be accessed, but it just hasn't been marketed well.
Right. That's why you're here. You know, truly, Reverie and accessing these intuitive hits, right? And you also gave a great breakdown of what intuition is, for somebody who is very solid in their thinking in the book. And I often considered intuition to be kind of like an advanced pattern recognition, right? And to get access to that, we've got to unfocus and build this into our day. And again, there isn't a cookie cutter way to go about this, but one general recommendation that you give is 45 minutes of focused work and give yourself, 15 minutes, 20 minutes of unfocused time and spend some time in Reverie and some of these other strategies that we're going to talk about. But this is being intentional. And what's going to happen is, I love this analogy as well, thinking about this capacity like a light bulb. And a light bulb, and if we're just trying to jam all of this focus energy into it and blowing a fuse versus intentionally dimming the light bulb and turning things down. And with that version, we can turn it back up whenever we want to and focus, and the light is there versus blowing it out. And that might just have us cooked for the rest of the day or even longer potentially if we're just constantly trying to force ourselves to focus. And one of the other cool things that you share is that our brains are looking for a way out all the time anyways. We're spending almost 50% of our day unfocusing on accident and then trying to grab our focus back.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why when people say, I don't have time to meditate or I don't have time to unfocus, I'm like, you're doing it 50% of the day. Your mind is not staying on task. There's a need for it to try to go somewhere. Why not interact with whatever that journey is? It's a little bit like if your dog is on a leash pulling you in different directions, you might submit just to see what it's trying to show you. Your mind is trying to show you the way. But if you try to overly control it, you're not letting it take you there. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that this network is so crucial in guiding us toward things, but it's also very crucial in letting answers arrive. So an example is Albert Einstein, who talked about his theory of relativity and who said that it was not a logical process for him. It was a musical perception. He said it arrived, and then I try to make sense of it. But a lot of the great things we're looking for in life are things that need to arrive. And remember, intelligence is having the ability not just to pursue, but to allow things to arrive. And I think what the Unfocused Network does is it creates a mechanism for this arrival to have impact. Carrie Banks Mullis is a person who founded synthetic DNA. And his lab mates hated him. They were like, he's not a real scientist. He just does whatever. He's making all these leaps. He's not following a linear progression. And on one particular day, nobody knew how to do this. He was driving with his girlfriend from Berkeley to Mendocino. And he was like, he stopped by the wayside and they had a little bit of wine. And they stopped and then he scribbled on a rock face. Eventually went up to their small cabin and eureka, suddenly this whole idea arrived, and he recognized that he had made a major discovery of the century. That kind of arrival of an idea. If you ask yourself, why am I not open to the arrival of amazing ideas? I think I think it's a really good question for us to ask ourselves. One of the many ways in which I sometimes frame intuition is that I feel like intuitions are the whispers of God asking to be heard. And if we can listen to them rather than ignore them, and do what I call insular mapping, where the intuition is activating multiple parts of your brain. One of them is this region that is related to the self. If you're getting some kind of thing like, I got a hunch, people will often say to me, people show you who they are in the first 10 nanoseconds of meeting them. Why would you not follow your intuition? Well, because maybe you're wrong. Well, then you don't have to be committed to it, but don't ignore your intuition. Mm-hmm. Your intuition is not some vague thing that only a few people have. We are all wired for intuition. And so I think to the extent that we are wired for intuition, we want to be able to use this intuition to discover this way of opening up, I think, the world of hunches. Because often the things we want don't come through connecting concrete things. You have one hunch and another hunch and another hunch, and all of a sudden, you've arrived somewhere. So I think intuition is a capacity that is served by this brain network, which I think if we really cared about expressing our full intelligence, we would take Unfocus seriously so we can allow intuition to do its thing.
Yeah. By the way, Kary Mullis won a Nobel Prize. And also you mentioned he was doing a bunch of other stuff. Like he wasn't consistent in his field of, quote, science.
Right.
And he was like he opened a bakery or something like that. Like just all these random things, but it all kind of, this conglomeration of life experiences came together with something that changed the world. And the same thing with Einstein. Like he was working in a patent office. Right. He wasn't this prestigious scientist and all these things, but just being in these different situations. And I remember him talking about, and I read his biography years ago, just doing these thought experiments and just going on kind of daydreaming, like seeing life through these different perspectives in his mind and coming up with these formulations and just seemingly radical ideas that change the way that we do things today. And so giving ourselves permission, because in our society today, it's really beating us into this perception that you've got to focus, you've got to do this one thing. But we're not, and just to reiterate this, we're not shitting on focus. No. Focus is an incredibly valuable aspect of humanity and of our potential. But we're so much more than that. We're so much more. And to be able to pull in all of our deepest resources, we need to practice allowing ourselves to unfocus as well. And so I want to ask you about another one of these. So we talked about Reverie, a little bit about imagination as well, mind wandering. So what's the difference with Reverie and mind wandering?
So I think mind wandering is a more neutral term than Reverie. Reverie has a certain kind of, like a kind of wisps of nostalgia, sort of, wandering through your mind with an attitude. I think mind wandering could just be your mind going wild, and that's the negative side of mind wandering. Or it could be mind wandering in search of ideas. So they're very similar, except that I think the term reverie comes with an emotional nuance. Reverie is something that's super important in psychotherapy, for example. Ogden wrote a lot about this, and when we were trained in psychotherapy, when I first went there, the way that, if you look at the internet, people would think everything is like, well, reframe this, change this, rethink it, distract yourself, do this. But what Ogden found was that creating a space for mind wandering as the reverie variant of mind wandering allowed people to discover things they would never have discovered. And so in that state, I think reverie is a form of mind wandering that helps people to unearth things about themselves that they never would. Now, you might ask, well, how does that happen? But I think you sort of alluded to that earlier on when you talked about the fact that, so the way that I think about this metaphorically is I think of the focus network as eating stuff with a fork, right? So you pick it up, it's solid, you can eat it. But with the unfocused network, you now are introducing a spoon to taste the delicious melange of flavors in your life. The scent of your grandmother, the smell of apples in the fall. You also have these chopsticks, metaphorically, which are like making connections across. So now you don't just have a fork, you have this ability to go across your food. And metaphorically, you also have a kind of marrow spoon. So you're going to the nooks and crannies of your brain. There's so much that is valuable that mining for your intelligence is paradoxically facilitated by being more passive, by being in this reverie form of mind wandering, because then all the little things about yourself suddenly start coming to the fore. We were talking about going to the movies the other day. One of the things that I think is so cool about the movies is there are scenes sometimes that just affect you and you're not really sure why. There's no logic. It's just out of the blue, you discover a part of yourself that you've never known before. I have a patient now who's at a pretty prominent position in medicine in the world. And when I first saw him, he was referred to me. They were like, "We know you'll know what to do with this guy." And I'm like, "Why? What's the issue?" They go, "He just can't stop smelling books." And I was like, "What do you mean? He's smelling books?" He loves to smell books. And so when I first saw him, I asked him about it. I said, and they were like, "We think maybe he has OCD because he can't stop doing this." So when I asked him, he said, "I'm compelled by the smell of books. Every book has a story of the past. And when I smell the pages and I have it close to my nose, it just makes me feel like I'm in a different world." And subsequently, I found he liked smelling everything. In the session, he'd be smelling his fingers. And some people would be like, that's in society, we're taught that the sense of smell, it has a special place in society, fragrance maybe, but not the notion of like what is real about who you are. And I think what that did was he used his senses to let him go into the state of reverie, where he'd be making up all these stories that were not even sensible. Our stories don't have to make logical sense. Words don't have to be tied by logic for us to have stories. Some of our stories come in smells. Some of our stories come in tastes. Some of our stories come in touch. And the more time we give ourselves to realize that, the less likely it will be that we will be on our deathbed saying, "What happened to me?" I can't tell you how many people I've seen over the course of my life who are incredibly well-known people who've done an amazing service for society, who later on in their lives are like, "I don't know what happened to the last 30 years of my life. I literally don't know. Like I feel like I feel like I can't be on earth anymore because I feel like I just wasted my life because I never took the time." What this does, what reverie does and mind wandering does, is it gives you time to savor. If you just, I remember my dad used to be like this with chocolates. I'd give him a chocolate that I loved, and I would be like, "Oh, you got to taste this Lindt pistache." He'd be like, "Oh yeah, this tastes good." He'd chomp on it, and I'd be like, "What are you doing?" The chocolate. He goes, "No, it's tasty," and I was like, "No, let it linger in your mouth, just like for what? It's gonna melt and so that for me is a metaphor for what happens when you're mind wandering or when you're in reverie. Mind wandering and reverie are opportunities for savoring life. And when we savor life, our level of appreciation becomes much greater and gratitude becomes more than a cognitive construct. I'm not a fan of gratitude as a cognitive construct. I think it's overused in a certain way. So when people are like, "Oh, I have gratitude," I feel slightly like, ugh. I don't know if I want to like connect to that. It's like gratitude, but when gratitude is like, "Oh man, like this is amazing. This is amazing." Like when you feel that thankfulness, and it's not just a cognitive construct or a habit of like, "What am I grateful for?" Like most people who do that, you can come up with plenty of things you're grateful for, but the depth of gratitude is, I think it's a feeling that is akin to a bow. So when there is greatness, a force that is greater than you, when you are in a position of awe, the most beautiful thing about it is the experience of what I call the spiritual bow. It is bowing before greatness that allows us to feel connected to something greater than ourselves. And that, I think, is where gratitude plays a role.
I love this. I'm grateful for this. I'm so grateful for this.
Well, that's am I. So,
All right. I've got and little fun fact, by the way, when you're talking about the smelly guy, um, it's as far as our senses, most related to our long-term memory, right? This olfactory sense, our sense of smell. And this is why, again, you smell something today and it might remind you of something 40 years ago, from your childhood. It's very, very deeply. But music can do the same. There's so many things. But our sense of smell is very, very powerful. And it's one of the things that's uniquely human. Like our flavor palette is so dynamic, and it has a lot to do with our nose. I remember in school even being taught about this taste buds, you got these little, but it's really our sense of smell. And if anybody wants to have a visceral experience of that, when you're sick and you can't really smell, sinus congested, food tastes super weird because your smell isn't there kind of like navigating the party. And so after you broke down a little bit more what mind wandering is, it kind of got me thinking about being free range, just letting your mind be free range.
Yeah.
If that's a good analogy for it.
Yeah, because there's a territory through which the mind can wander that is far greater than the real estate that we give it. Most of us confine ourselves to these very small spaces of exploration.
Factory farmed.
Right. Why wouldn't you go far and wide? Why wouldn't you think of the most improbable things? Why wouldn't you? And this is not just about hope, by the way. This is about conditioning your brain. So there was a study, for example, that gave people the same paste, neutral paste, and they labeled one paste lidocaine for pain relief, and the other one capsaicin, the active ingredient in chili, and the one was neutral. When they gave people the lidocaine, it was a neutral paste. People were like, oh, this feels like kind of calming, so pain relief. And you look in their brains, and the reward center was turned on. When you gave people the capsaicin, the active ingredient in chili, people were like, this kind of stings. And you looked in their brain, and the pain center was turned on. So in that instance, it was not the reality that was changing their brains. It was the expectation that put one brain in a state of reward, so it would keep going, and it put the other brain in a state of pain, so it would stop. So when we're thinking about possibility, when we're thinking about upping our game, what we want to do is keep ourselves in a rewarded state so we can keep exploring beyond just the narrow confines of our minds. And as we talked about earlier, with relationships, it gets even funkier because now you're in a state of entanglement and you're in a state of exploration where you're exploring together and you go off on your own and you come back together. It's an amazing way of being. So I think if people could recognize that that they're falling into this trap of physical real estate, when in fact their minds were metaphorically built to fly wherever they want to fly.
Yes, yes. Just a couple more, and there's so much more. This is one of my favorite books. It just shot right to the top.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it.
But certain books as well, it's timely, right? I'm at a place where I fully receive this and the ideas, and just there were so many affirmations, things that I was doing on accident and showing up with certain results, and then certain things were just giving me permission as well. And so we'll talk about a couple more of these really quickly. The strategies to unfocus. There's several more in the book. But another one is using your body to unfocus. Talk about that. How does that work?
Well, a lot of people think that intelligence is only in the brain. And I think one big advantage we have over AI in its current form is that it doesn't have a body. And so if you just think about one simple thing, when we talk about stress, we talk about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So immediately we're saying there's an intelligence that's not just in the brain. When we talk about the gut-brain connection, immediately we're saying there's an intelligence that's not just in the brain, it's connected to the gut. And now it is pretty widely believed that human intelligence exists throughout the body. And a lot of times people feel like the only way in which they can get through their troubles is to think through it. But we now know that physical exercise, for example, is an amazing treatment for depression. You can't always use an emotional route to treat an emotional problem. Sometimes you use a physical route to treat an emotional problem. On the Relay platform, because I wanted to make sure that we didn't just we have videos, and we have videos of celebrities, we have videos of nature, of geometry, of fractals. and we've designed all of those based on science and how the science shows us what it impacts in the brain. We're now developing an embodiment platform. And what I want people to recognize is that when you embody something, it elevates you away from the state of what you're saying. For example, imagine saying yes enthusiastically. If you say yes, yeah, there are ways you can emphasize that. But if you're like, yes, all of a sudden the yes is in your body, and you're not just stuck in the mind of your yes. The yes is distributed throughout your body. So when I talk about unfocusing through embodiment, I'm asking people to recognize that intelligence, like helping your depression, helping your anxiety, can come through walking, through exercise. That actually intelligence is widely distributed in the body, and being able to embody your feelings. This is why we enjoy actors, right? We enjoy great actors because they're not just saying things beautifully. You can feel it in their bodies. When they're committed to something, you can feel it in their bones. And so a question to ask yourself is, your points of view, the things you love, have you created space in your life to feel it in your bones? Where you're like, this is such an amazing thing. Or, I think we've outsourced our emotions for the most part. I mean, how often have you heard someone say, oh my God, that's so funny? I'm like, what? If it's funny, why are you not laughing? They're like, it's like, oh, wait a minute. I can say it, so why express it through my body?
Yeah.
Because people are like, oh no, I can't like jerk around, and why not? So unfocusing reveals, I think, a coherence and a congruence in our bodies, and you see this in great sports players. When they're in the zone, there's no mind-body split. It's all operating in the same way. I could sense from when you were talking about smells that you probably have moments when you're cooking where it's all one. And when you're in that, so you just know that the thing you're making is just going to be the bomb, because there's something about the way you're not technically adding 2 teaspoons of this and 3 teaspoons of that. It just comes together in a certain way. But in that moment of the stirring of the pot, that is love, that is intelligence. I'm a firm believer that changes how the food is created. Yeah. And the more you can give yourself to that embodied sensation, so it's not stuck in your brain as just a thought. You're not just putting, sometimes to learn a recipe, it's fine to do 2 teaspoons of this and 3 teaspoons of that. But at some point, you want to let yourself go so that whatever you're making, the heartiness of it is embodying who you are. And you can feel what that is in your body.
Yeah. My mother-in-law, I know she's listening right now, and this really speaks to her. She's never made the same thing twice. When she's making our favorite Kenyan dishes, chele, skuma wiki, and it never tastes the same because she's just going off of what feels, how certain things feel. And I've had some of the best food experiences of my life. And sometimes I have expectation of like, I'm expecting it to taste this way, but then it's totally different, and just being open to that and receiving that love that's transferred over in that food. And we know even through the phantom DNA experiment that humans, our attention changes the very stuff that reality is made of, And so the fact that we impact and change food with our feeling and our emotion is very real. So thank you for sharing that.
But there's another example, which is it's in the preliminary stages, but I was intrigued by the lab results. So when people talk about the frequency of love, they often refer to it as 528 hertz. I don't fully understand that, but it's a certain frequency that's been identified as embodying what love is. Well, they took 2 dishes with brain cells in them, astrocytes, and they passed that frequency through one dish, not the other. And both of the cells were bathed in alcohol at a level of toxicity. What they found was that in the dish that had the frequency of love going through it, or 528 hertz, even if you don't want to call it that, that dish had 100% less free radicals, toxic radicals, showing that frequency can change the nature of cells. We're now understanding that sound can change what cells are. And so I think that we pay too much attention to the concrete in the world. And the concrete is it's cool, it's there, you can see it, it feeds your sense organs. But there are many more things to you than your sense organs. And the default mode network is one of those really cool parts of your brain that will expose to you that you are more than just your senses. You are this complex, integrated, highly intelligent being that can experience and integrate these heightened states of awareness. And I think love is one of those things that immediately elevates one to this heightened state of awareness, whether it comes from a person or through a dish. You can feel it in either instance.
Yes, we have access to that.
Yes,
at all times. That's so powerful, so powerful. I was going to ask you about one more strategy to assist us in unfocus. Again, there's many more in the book, so it's hard for me to pick from the list here of what to ask you about. But one of them is to create a tinker table. Let's talk about creating a tinker table.
Well, I often think that people create these fixed agendas, and they're like, if I don't stick to this agenda, I'm not going to get stuff done. And as you said, focus is an amazing thing. So it's fine to have focus in different parts of your calendar. But once you start to give yourself a little bit more permission, where you're not procrastinating, you're living in the dynamic dance of your life. You're essentially tinkering with your timetable, and you're saying, oh, I think I'll move the 10 to 12 here. Oh, I think, a friend called me the other day, and I was sort of like, just got to the place where I was like, I just need another 7 hours and I will get caught up on everything. It was a Sunday. And it's a friend I particularly like. And when he texted me, he was like, why don't you come down? And I was like, oh God, if I go down now, I'm not going to get this work done. Now, in certain instances, I wouldn't go if the deadline were the next day. But I knew that the deadline was further out. And so I did not regret saying, this chunk of time, I'm going to redistribute it. I'm going to tinker throughout the day. I'm going to tinker in different parts of my calendar. And once you stop thinking of this as procrastination, but start thinking of this as the dance of your life, you will realize that our time blocks do not have to be ever cemented representations of what we need to do. Some things are, like this, like setting a meeting time. I'm not going to be like, well, maybe I'll come at a certain time. I hope you're there. But there are many things in our lives. And if you don't have this, I'd ask you to look at your life again, because I think everyone's life should have the ability to have the flexibility to tinker around with their times so that they don't have these fixed tables. And, which is why I've given people access to a tinker table. And I'd encourage anyone who's interested in it. We have a process through getting the book, and that the tinker table can be a super helpful way of learning how to not just reorganize your life, but add a dynamic quality to your life. Because as long as we're alive, we might as well be dynamic. Why stay in a rigid, sort of fossilized existence? The fossils are for later. Now is the time to feel alive.
Yes. Yeah. So can you let everybody know where to get a copy of the book? And also, you mentioned these additional resources as well.
Sure. So you can get a copy of the book on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, pretty much anywhere online. You can get it at a local bookstore. I would encourage you to try to get it from Amazon. And if you're interested, once you have the book, in getting the Tinker Table and other resources, feel free to email us at solutions@neurobusinessgroup.com. So it's solutions at NEURO, and then the word business, all one word, group, all one word. So neurobusinessgroup.com. And we'd be happy to walk you through what we have so that you can use that in conjunction with the book to take your life to the next level.
Amazing. You mentioned Roulette a couple of times. Can you talk a little bit more about what people can look forward to with Roulette?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll have a link on your site.
Yeah.
So Roulette is an app, and it's AI-driven, and it's personalized video therapeutic experiences, which we've shown at Mayo Clinic can help to lower emotional distress, anxiety, and improve focus. So if people sign up to Roulette, they'll be able to get these experiences that we've shown can help people. And the more you tell the app what you like and what you don't like, the more it will find personalized experiences for you. And we didn't get into sort of fractals and geometry, but all the art that we've created on the platform is art that has been structured based on how the body responds to the art. So geometry, for example, as an example, the brain doesn't really like upside down triangles because they're unstable. So it tends to prefer stable base. Or fractals, which are just repeated patterns in art, can actually restore sort of tissue well-being. So we've created scientific methods to expose people to these different kinds of art, and we're seeing a decent amount of success in it. So I'd encourage anyone who's interested in having a mindset shift on demand when you're just not feeling good on a particular day. You just need 3 minutes of a reset. Please check out Roulette and see if it's for you.
Amazing. And also, of course, we'll have that for everybody in the show notes. But if you go to themodelhealthshow.com/Roulette, which is spelled REULAY.
Correct.
You're going to get access to an exclusive discount as well. So themodelhealthshow.com/Roulette for a special discount. This has been phenomenal. I'm enjoying myself so much. There's so many other things I want to talk to you about. I would love to do this again.
Yeah, I would love it too.
Your work has been so impactful in my life, and it's just like, it's so exciting. Like, you've activated, or helped to activate, by creating this resource, just a new level of inspiration and fun, right? I feel like I'm activating a fun season right now, and just changing the way that I'm viewing reality. And often that's what life is all about, these shifts in perception, right? And they can come from some really unexpected places. Sometimes they can come from a conversation. Sometimes they can come from reading a good book. And this is one of my favorite books. Jump right to that top list of my favorite books, Tinker Dabble Doodle Try. Everybody pick up a copy. Thank you so much for coming to hang out with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been more than a delight.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
The process of manifesting, you have to understand, how do I embed something into my unconscious or subconscious? And you do that through a process called value tagging. And what I mean by that is, you have to demonstrate to the brain that something is important to you.